Lieutenant Sarah Martinez stepped off the transport truck at Forward Operating Base Viper, her boots hitting the dusty ground with a soft thud. The Afghan sun blazed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the sprawling military compound. She adjusted her pack and looked around at the maze of concrete barriers, prefab buildings, and armed soldiers going about their daily routines. Nobody looked her way. Nobody acknowledged her arrival. She might as well have been invisible. Sarah had expected this. At 26, she was young for an officer, and, in a combat zone dominated by seasoned veterans who had been deployed multiple times, she knew she would have to prove herself. What she hadn't expected was the complete indifference that greeted her as she made her way to the command center. The base was home to nearly 3,000 soldiers, contractors, and support personnel. It was a small city in the middle of nowhere, complete with its own power grid, water treatment facility, and communication systems. For the next 12 months, this would be Sarah's home, and these people would be her colleagues, subordinates, and superiors. She found the personnel office tucked between the motor pool and the communications building. A tired-looking sergeant looked up from his computer screen as she entered, his expression suggesting he had better things to do than process another new arrival. "Martinez, right," he said without enthusiasm, already turning back to his screen. "You're assigned to the intelligence section. Building C7. Someone there will get you sorted." Sarah thanked him and left, following the hand-drawn map he'd given her. The intelligence section was housed in a windowless concrete building that looked like every other structure on the base. Inside, the air conditioning hummed loudly, fighting against the desert heat that seemed to seep through every crack and crevice. Major Richards, the section chief, barely glanced up when she reported for duty. He was a heavy-set man in his 40s with tired eyes and the general demeanor of someone who had seen too much and cared too little. When he finally acknowledged her presence, it was with a dismissive wave toward an empty desk in the corner. "You'll be handling routine reports," he said, his tone making it clear that routine reports were about as important as counting grains of sand. "Corporal Jenkins will show you the systems. Try not to break anything." Corporal Jenkins turned out to be a young man from Ohio who looked like he would rather be anywhere else in the world. He walked Sarah through the computer systems with the enthusiasm of someone reading a phone book aloud. The intelligence section, she quickly learned, was where information came to die. Reports from patrols, intercepted communications, and surveillance data all flowed through their desks, where they were categorized, filed, and mostly forgotten. "Most of it's just noise," Jenkins explained as he showed her the filing system. "But occasionally something important comes through, and we have to make sure it gets to the right people." Not that they usually listen anyway. Sarah's first few weeks at FOB Viper fell into a predictable rhythm. She arrived at the office each morning at 0700, reviewed overnight reports, and spent her days sorting through intelligence data that rarely seemed to lead anywhere meaningful. The other officers in her section treated her with polite indifference, neither hostile nor welcoming. She was simply another body filling a chair, another name on the duty roster. During meals in the dining facility, she often sat alone, reading reports on her tablet while around her, groups of soldiers shared stories and jokes from previous deployments. She tried joining conversations a few times, but her contributions were met with polite nods and quick changes of subject. She was an outsider, and everyone seemed determined to keep it that way. The base had its own social hierarchy, invisible but rigid. The combat armed soldiers, especially those from the infantry and special operations units, occupied the top tier. They were the ones who went outside the wire, who faced the enemy directly, who had the stories worth telling. Below them were the support troops, the mechanics and medics and communications specialists who kept the base running. At the bottom, apparently, were the intelligence officers who spent their days staring at computer screens and filing reports. Sarah had graduated top of her class from the Military Intelligence Officer Basic Course. She spoke 3 languages fluently, including Pashto and Dari, the primary languages spoken in Afghanistan. She had a master's degree in international relations and had spent 2 years working with the Defense Intelligence Agency before requesting deployment to a forward operating base. None of this seemed to matter to anyone at FOB Viper. Her direct supervisor, Captain Brooks, was a career intelligence officer who had managed to avoid deployment for most of his 10-year career. He treated Sarah's assignment to his section as an unwelcome burden, another junior officer he would have to babysit until her rotation ended. During their weekly meetings, he barely looked at her reports, instead focusing on administrative matters that seemed designed to keep her busy rather than productive. The key to success here, he told her during one of these meetings, is not to rock the boat. We have established procedures, established relationships with the other sections. Your job is to follow those procedures and maintain those relationships. Nothing more, nothing less. Sarah nodded and agreed, but privately she wondered what the point was of having an intelligence section that seemed determined to avoid actually analyzing intelligence. She began staying late in the office, after the others had left for the day, reading through old reports and looking for patterns that others might have missed. The base received dozens of reports every day from patrols, local informants, and surveillance systems. Most were routine: suspicious activity near a certain road, possible weapons cache in an abandoned building, unusual vehicle movement in a particular village. The information was catalogued and filed, but rarely connected to create a larger picture. Sarah started creating her own database, cross-referencing locations, times, and types of activity. She noticed that many of the reports that were dismissed as unrelated actually formed patterns when viewed together. A series of seemingly random vehicle movements began to look like a supply route when mapped over time. Reports of strangers asking questions in different villages started to resemble a reconnaissance operation when compared side by side. She brought her findings to Captain Brooks, who glanced at her charts and graphs with barely concealed irritation. "This is exactly what I was talking about," he said, pushing her papers back across his desk. "You're trying to see connections that aren't there. These reports have already been evaluated by people with much more experience than you have. If there were patterns worth noting, they would have been noted." Sarah persisted, pointing out specific examples where her analysis revealed previously unnoticed connections, but Brooks remained unmoved. He reminded her that her job was to process reports, not to conduct independent analysis, and suggested she focus on her assigned duties rather than chasing shadows. Frustrated but not defeated, Sarah continued her work in secret. She arrived early and stayed late, using her own time to build a comprehensive picture of enemy activity in their area of operations. The more data she analyzed, the more convinced she became that something significant was being overlooked by the official intelligence process. The base's location made it a natural target for enemy forces. Situated along a major supply route and housing both conventional and special operations units, FOB Viper represented a valuable prize for any group capable of mounting a coordinated attack. Yet the official intelligence assessments consistently rated the threat level as low to moderate, based primarily on the lack of recent attacks in the immediate area. Sarah's analysis suggested otherwise. The pattern of activity she had identified indicated careful, patient preparation for something much larger than the random attacks and harassing fire that characterized most enemy activity in the region. The surveillance, the supply movements, the recruitment efforts in nearby villages, they all pointed toward a coordinated operation being planned against the base. She tried once more to bring her concerns to Captain Brooks, this time with a formal written assessment supported by detailed evidence. He read it with obvious annoyance, then filed it away without comment. "Lieutenant Martinez," he said, his tone carrying a warning, "I'm going to say this once more, and I hope it will be the last time I need to say it. Your job is not to second-guess the intelligence process. Your job is not to conduct independent analysis. Your job is to process routine reports and maintain our filing systems. If you cannot or will not focus on those duties, I will have no choice but to recommend your reassignment to a position better suited to your capabilities." The threat was clear. Sarah could continue pushing and find herself transferred to some dead-end assignment, or she could keep quiet and hope someone else would eventually notice what she had discovered. Neither option appealed to her, but, for the moment, she had little choice but to back down. That evening, as she walked back to her quarters through the maze of concrete barriers and guard towers, Sarah felt more isolated than ever. The base was full of people, but she might as well have been alone. Her training had prepared her for many things, but not for the crushing weight of being right about something important and having no one willing to listen. She thought about her father, a career army officer who had always told her that the military was a meritocracy, where good work and dedication would eventually be recognized and rewarded. He had served in Vietnam and, later in the Gulf War, and his stories had inspired her to pursue her own military career. She wondered what he would think of her situation now, stuck in a job where competence seemed to be viewed as a liability rather than an asset. Back in her small room in the officers' quarters, Sarah spread her unofficial analysis across her desk and studied it once more. The patterns were clear to her, but apparently invisible to everyone else. She had identified what appeared to be the early stages of a major coordinated attack, but her warnings had been dismissed by supervisors who seemed more interested in maintaining the status quo than in protecting the base. Outside her window, she could see the perimeter lights of FOB Viper stretching into the distance, a small island of artificial light in the vast darkness of the Afghan countryside. Somewhere out there, if her analysis was correct, enemy forces were watching and planning and preparing to turn that light into a target. Sarah closed her files and prepared for bed, knowing that tomorrow would bring more of the same, more reports to file, more patterns to ignore, more opportunities for her superiors to demonstrate their complete lack of interest in anything she had to say. She had come to Afghanistan to serve her country and protect her fellow soldiers, but, so far, the biggest enemy she had encountered was the institutional indifference of her own command structure. As she drifted off to sleep, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, that somewhere in the darkness beyond the perimeter, events were moving toward a conclusion that no one at FOB Viper was prepared for. She had done everything she could to sound the alarm, but, in a place where her voice carried no weight, even the most urgent warnings fell on deaf ears. Tomorrow would be another day of being ignored, another day of watching important intelligence disappear into filing cabinets, another day of knowing that her skills and training were being wasted while real threats went unrecognized. But tomorrow would also bring new information, new opportunities to build her case, and perhaps new chances to find someone willing to listen. Sarah Martinez had not come this far to give up now. One way or another, she was determined to make her voice heard, even if it meant risking everything she had worked for. The soldiers of FOB Viper deserved protection, even if they didn't know it yet, and she was prepared to fight for them whether they wanted her to or not. 3 months into her deployment, Sarah had settled into an uncomfortable routine of professional isolation and personal determination. Her official duties remained mind-numbingly routine, but her unofficial intelligence analysis had grown into a comprehensive picture of threat patterns that no one in authority seemed interested in examining. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning in October, when a patrol report crossed her desk that made her blood run cold. Sergeant First Class Williams, leading a routine patrol through the village of Kerbog, had noted unusual activity, strangers asking detailed questions about the base's supply schedules, guard rotations, and vehicle movements. The report was filed under routine surveillance and slated for the standard bureaucratic burial that awaited most such intelligence. But Sarah recognized the village name immediately. Kerbog had appeared in 17 previous reports over the past 2 months, each time in connection with seemingly unrelated suspicious activities. When viewed individually, the reports meant nothing. Taken together, they painted a picture of systematic intelligence gathering that was far more sophisticated than anything the base's official threat assessment acknowledged. She cross-referenced the timeline with her private database and felt her stomach clench. According to her analysis, the enemy intelligence gathering had reached a critical phase. If the patterns she had identified were accurate, they were looking at a coordinated attack sometime in the next 2 to 3 weeks. This time, Sarah decided to bypass Captain Brooks entirely. She prepared a detailed briefing and requested a meeting with Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, the base commander. The request was denied within hours, with a terse note suggesting she follow proper channels through her immediate supervisor. Captain Brooks was waiting for her when she arrived at work the next morning, his expression dark with barely controlled anger. "I understand you tried to go around me to the colonel," he said, closing the office door behind her. "I thought I had made myself clear about your role here, Lieutenant." "Apparently, I was mistaken." Sarah stood at attention, her jaw set in determination. "Sir, I believe we have identified a credible threat to base security that requires immediate attention. The intelligence patterns I've documented suggest the intelligence patterns you think you've documented," Brooks interrupted, "are the product of an overactive imagination and a dangerous tendency to see conspiracies where none exist. You are a junior officer with no combat experience and no understanding of how things work in a real operational environment. He moved to his desk and pulled out a thick folder, dropping it in front of her with theatrical emphasis. This contains similar analysis from 3 other junior intelligence officers over the past 2 years. All of them saw patterns. All of them predicted imminent attacks. All of them were wrong. The only thing their predictions accomplished was to create unnecessary panic and divert resources from real priorities. Sarah's hands remained steady, but inside she was reeling. She had been so certain of her analysis, so confident in the patterns she had identified. Was it possible that she was just another inexperienced officer seeing threats that didn't exist? Sir, if I could just show you the specific correlations. No, Brooks cut her off sharply. What you're going to do is stop this amateur detective work immediately. You're going to focus on your assigned duties and nothing else. And if I hear that you've been spreading your conspiracy theories to anyone else on this base, you'll find yourself on the next transport back to the States with a fitness report that will end your career before it really begins. The threat hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Sarah had worked too hard to get where she was to throw it all away on what might be a mistake. But she also couldn't shake the conviction that her analysis was correct, that something terrible was being planned, and that her silence might cost lives. She spent the rest of that day processing routine reports in sullen silence, while around her the normal business of the intelligence section continued unchanged. Corporal Jenkins tried to engage her in conversation a few times, but she was too distracted to respond with more than monosyllables. That evening, she sat in her quarters staring at her private files, trying to find flaws in her own analysis. She went through each report again, checking dates and locations, looking for errors in her methodology. But every review only reinforced her original conclusions. The patterns were real, the threat was credible, and time was running out. Unable to sleep, Sarah walked the perimeter of the base in the early morning darkness, past the guard towers and concrete barriers that were supposed to protect them. The soldiers on duty nodded politely but paid her little attention. She was just another officer taking a late-night walk, nothing more. But, as she walked, she studied the base's defenses with new eyes, trying to see them as an attacker would. The patterns of guard rotations, the blind spots in the surveillance coverage, the predictable timing of supply convoys, all the information that had appeared in the reports she had been analyzing. If someone was indeed planning an attack, they would have detailed knowledge of the base's vulnerabilities. The next few days passed in a haze of frustration and growing anxiety. Sarah continued her official duties while privately monitoring new intelligence reports for any sign that would confirm or refute her analysis. Each day brought new information that seemed to support her conclusions, but she had no outlet for sharing her concerns. Then, on Friday afternoon, everything changed. A convoy returning from a supply run reported an unusual encounter near the village of Spin Boldak, 12 kilometers south of the base. The patrol leader, Staff Sergeant Morrison, had noticed several vehicles following his convoy at a distance, matching their speed and maintaining visual contact for nearly an hour before breaking off. The report landed on Sarah's desk along with the usual collection of routine intelligence summaries. But this wasn't routine, not if her analysis was correct. Spin Boldak was a key location in the pattern she had identified, and surveillance of supply convoys was exactly the kind of intelligence gathering she had predicted would escalate as an attack approached. She rushed to Captain Brooks's office, the report clutched in her hand, her professional composure finally cracking under the weight of her convictions. "Sir, this report from Staff Sergeant Morrison, it confirms the pattern I've been tracking. They're conducting final reconnaissance for an attack." We need to what, Lieutenant?" Brooks's voice was dangerously quiet. "Alert the entire base because a convoy noticed some vehicles on the road? Do you have any idea how many false alarms we've dealt with because junior officers think every suspicious vehicle is part of some grand conspiracy?" Sarah felt her career hanging in the balance, but she pressed on. "Sir, this isn't an isolated incident. When you combine it with the intelligence gathering in Kerbog, the movement patterns I've documented, and the timeline of escalating surveillance, it all points to a young officer who has read too many thriller novels and doesn't understand the difference between fiction and reality," Brooks snapped. "I'm done with this, Martinez. You're obviously unable to function effectively in your current position. He picked up his phone and dialed an extension. Colonel Harrison? I need to see you about reassigning Lieutenant Martinez. Yes, sir. Immediately. Sarah's heart sank as she realized what was happening. In trying to protect the base, she had instead triggered her own removal from any position where she might be able to help. Brooks was about to have her transferred to some meaningless administrative role where her warnings would be even more irrelevant than they already were. But, as they waited for Colonel Harrison's response, the base's alarm system suddenly came to life. The distinctive wail of the attack siren filled the air, followed immediately by the recorded voice directing all personnel to seek immediate shelter. Brooks and Sarah looked at each other in confusion. Attack sirens were tested regularly, but this was neither the scheduled day nor the scheduled time. Through the office window, they could see soldiers running toward defensive positions, their movements urgent and purposeful. The confusion lasted only seconds before the first explosion shattered the afternoon calm. The windows of the intelligence building rattled in their frames as a massive blast echoed across the base. Then came a second explosion, closer this time, followed by the distinctive crack of rifle fire and the deeper rumble of heavy weapons. The base was under attack. Brooks grabbed his radio and tried to contact the command center, but got only static in response. Outside, the sound of gunfire was growing more intense, punctuated by the whistle and crash of incoming mortars. Sarah felt a sick vindication wash over her. She had been right about the threat, right about the timeline, right about everything her superiors had dismissed as the fantasies of an inexperienced officer. But being right provided no satisfaction when the cost might be measured in lives. The command center, she said, her voice cutting through the chaos. We need to get to the command center and coordinate intelligence support for the defense. Brooks looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. The dismissive arrogance was gone, replaced by the dawning realization that the junior officer he had been ignoring might have been trying to save them all. They ran from the building into a base transformed by violence. Smoke rose from several locations where mortars had found their mark. Soldiers moved between positions with the disciplined haste of professionals under fire, but Sarah could see the confusion in their movements. This wasn't the random harassment fire they were used to, this was something much more serious and coordinated. The command center was a fortress of sandbags and concrete barriers, its communications antennas reaching toward the sky like metal trees. Inside, controlled chaos reigned as officers and NCOs tried to coordinate a defense against an enemy that seemed to know exactly where and when to strike. Colonel Harrison stood at the center of it all, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the urgency surrounding him. He was receiving reports from multiple sources, trying to build a picture of the attack while simultaneously directing the response. Sarah and Captain Brooks entered the command center just as another wave of explosions rocked the base. Harrison glanced up from a radio handset and fixed his gaze on them. Brooks, I need current intelligence on enemy capabilities in this area. What do we know about coordination between local cells? What kind of support are they getting? For the first time since Sarah had known him, Captain Brooks looked genuinely uncertain. The attack had caught the intelligence section as off guard as everyone else, despite having all the information needed to predict it sitting in their files. Sir, we're still assessing, Brooks began, but his words were cut off by Sarah stepping forward. Colonel, I've been tracking pattern indicators for a coordinated attack for the past 3 months, she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. Based on my analysis, we're looking at multiple synchronized assault teams with detailed intelligence on our defenses and operations. Harrison's eyes sharpened with interest. What kind of intelligence? How detailed? Sarah quickly outlined the reconnaissance patterns she had identified, the systematic intelligence gathering in nearby villages, and the timeline that had pointed to an attack in this time frame. As she spoke, Harrison's expression grew more serious. Why wasn't this information in our threat assessments? He asked, looking between Sarah and Captain Brooks. Brooks opened his mouth to respond, but another explosion, much closer this time, sent everyone diving for cover as debris rattled against the command center's walls. When they picked themselves up, Sarah continued her briefing, now with the colonel's complete attention. She described the enemy's apparent knowledge of guard rotations, supply schedules, and defensive positions, all information that would allow them to maximize the effectiveness of their attack.
Recommendations? Harrison asked tersely.
They know our standard defensive procedures, Sarah replied. We need to assume they've planned for our predictable responses. I recommend shifting guard positions, altering patrol routes, and establishing secondary defensive lines that aren't part of our standard configuration.
Harrison nodded grimly and began issuing orders based on her assessment.
For the first time since arriving at FOB Viper, Sarah felt like her training and expertise were being put to proper use. But, even as she helped coordinate the intelligence support for the base's defense, she couldn't escape the bitter irony of the situation. Her warnings had been ignored until the moment they became irrelevant. Her analysis had been dismissed until it was too late to prevent the very attack it had predicted. The battle for FOB Viper was just beginning, and Sarah Martinez was finally being heard. But, the cost of that recognition might be higher than anyone was prepared to pay. The attack on FOB Viper unfolded exactly as Sarah's analysis had predicted it would. The enemy struck with precise coordination, targeting key infrastructure and defensive positions with the kind of detailed knowledge that could only come from months of careful surveillance and planning. What made the assault particularly devastating was not just its intensity, but its sophistication. This was not the work of poorly organized insurgents, but of a well-trained force with intimate knowledge of the base's operations. In the command center, Sarah found herself thrust into a role she had never expected to play. Colonel Harrison, recognizing that she understood the enemy's capabilities better than anyone else in the room, had effectively made her his primary intelligence advisor for the duration of the battle. It was the opportunity she had been seeking for months, but under circumstances she would never have wished for. They're hitting our fuel depot next, she told the colonel as she studied the pattern of attacks on her hastily drawn map.
It's the logical progression based on their timing and positioning.
Harrison immediately redirected 2 squads to reinforce the fuel storage area, just as another series of explosions erupted from that exact location. The pre-positioned defenders were able to repel the assault, but barely.
Without Sarah's warning, the fuel depot would have been destroyed, crippling the base's ability to maintain operations.
Captain Brooks stood to the side, watching his formerly dismissed subordinate coordinate intelligence operations with a skill and confidence that made his previous treatment of her look increasingly foolish.
Every prediction Sarah made proved accurate.
Every assessment she provided helped the defenders stay one step ahead of an enemy that seemed to know their every move. The battle raged for 6 hours. Wave after wave of coordinated attacks tested different sections of the perimeter, each one planned to exploit known vulnerabilities in the base's defenses. But, with Sarah's analysis guiding the response, Colonel Harrison was able to anticipate many of the enemy's moves and counter them effectively. As dawn broke over FOB Viper, the attackers began to withdraw, having failed to achieve their primary objectives thanks largely to intelligence work that had been dismissed as worthless just hours earlier. The base had held, but at a significant cost. 12 soldiers had been killed and 37 wounded.
Several key buildings had been damaged or destroyed.
The attack had been repelled, but it had also demonstrated just how vulnerable the base really was. In the aftermath, as medics treated the wounded and engineers assessed the damage, Colonel Harrison called Sarah into his office for a private conversation. Captain Brooks had already been summarily relieved of his duties and was awaiting transport back to the United States, his career effectively ended by his failure to recognize and act on credible intelligence. Lieutenant Martinez, the colonel began, his fatigue evident in every line of his face, I need to understand how we got to this point.
How did you know what was coming when our entire intelligence apparatus missed it?
Sarah had been dreading this conversation, knowing that her answer would necessarily criticize not just Captain Brooks, but the entire system that had allowed critical intelligence to be ignored for months. She chose her words carefully, trying to be honest without being insubordinate. Sir, the information was there in our files all along. The surveillance reports, the pattern of reconnaissance activities, the escalating intelligence gathering, it was all documented. But it was never analyzed as a comprehensive picture. Each report was treated as an isolated incident rather than part of a larger pattern. Why didn't you bring this to my attention sooner?
Harrison asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. I tried, sir. I prepared multiple assessments and briefings, but they never made it past the section level. I was told that my analysis was speculative and that I should focus on routine processing rather than independent investigation. Harrison was quiet for a long moment, clearly grappling with the implications of what Sarah was telling him. A coordinated attack had nearly succeeded because his intelligence section had been more interested in maintaining bureaucratic procedures than in actually analyzing intelligence. What's your assessment of current enemy capabilities? He asked finally. Sarah had been thinking about this question throughout the night. Sir, based on the sophistication of last night's attack, we're dealing with an enemy force that's much more capable than our official estimates suggested. They have detailed intelligence on our operations, professional training, and the ability to coordinate complex multi-phase operations. This wasn't a one-time effort, it was a test. A test? Yes, sir. They wanted to see how we would respond, what our reaction times were, where our weaknesses remain. They achieved most of their intelligence-gathering objectives even though they didn't overrun the base. I believe they're planning something bigger. Harrison leaned back in his chair, the weight of command evident in his posture. What do you recommend? For the first time since arriving at FOB Viper, Sarah felt like her training and expertise were being valued. She outlined a comprehensive plan for improving the base's intelligence operations, including better analysis protocols, improved information sharing, and proactive threat assessment procedures. We also need to assume that our current defensive procedures have been compromised, she added. Everything from guard rotations to supply schedules needs to be changed. The enemy has demonstrated detailed knowledge of our operations, so we have to operate on the assumption that they know everything we've been doing up to this point. Over the next several weeks, Sarah found herself effectively running the intelligence section while a replacement for Captain Brooks was located and assigned. It was a responsibility far beyond what her rank would normally warrant, but Colonel Harrison had made it clear that competence mattered more than seniority in the current situation. The transformation was remarkable. Intelligence reports that had previously been filed and forgotten were now analyzed for patterns and connections. Information from different sources was cross-referenced and evaluated comprehensively. Most importantly, credible threats were escalated immediately rather than buried in bureaucratic procedures. Sarah also began working directly with patrol leaders and special operations teams, providing them with detailed threat briefings based on current intelligence rather than outdated assessments. The change in attitude toward the intelligence section was dramatic. Soldiers who had previously viewed intelligence reports as worthless paperwork now relied on Sarah's analysis to plan their operations and protect their people. The improvement in intelligence operations didn't go unnoticed at higher levels of command. Within a month of the attack on FOB Viper, Sarah received orders to report to Regional Command Headquarters for a special assignment. She was being transferred to a new Joint Intelligence Task Force charged with developing better threat assessment procedures for forward operating bases throughout Afghanistan. Her replacement at FOB Viper was Major Patricia Chen, a seasoned intelligence officer with multiple deployments and a reputation for analytical excellence. During the turnover, Chen reviewed Sarah's work with obvious admiration. This is exactly the kind of analysis we should be doing at every base, she told Sarah as they went through the intelligence files. You've created a model that should be implemented across the entire theater of operations. Sarah felt a mix of pride and frustration as she prepared to leave FOB Viper. She had finally proven the value of her approach to intelligence analysis, but it had taken an attack that killed 12 soldiers to get anyone's attention. How many other bases were operating with the same kind of institutional blindness that had nearly led to disaster at Viper? Her last week at the base was unlike any of her previous months there. Soldiers who had barely acknowledged her existence now sought her out to thank her for her work. Officers who had dismissed her as an inexperienced junior colleague now asked for her advice on intelligence matters. The transformation was complete, but it had come at a price that Sarah would never forget. Colonel Harrison personally saw her off when she departed for her new assignment. Lieutenant Martinez, he said as they stood beside the transport helicopter that would take her away from FOB Viper, I owe you an apology. We all do.
Your analysis saved lives, and it should never have taken an attack for us to recognize that. Sarah accepted his words graciously, but privately she wondered how many other young officers were sitting at other bases right now, filing reports that no one would read, identifying patterns that no one would acknowledge, trying to prevent attacks that would be ignored until it was too late. As the helicopter lifted off and FOB Viper fell away beneath her, Sarah reflected on the lessons of her deployment. She had learned that being right was often not enough, that institutional inertia could be more dangerous than any enemy, and that sometimes the greatest threats to military effectiveness came from within the military itself. But she had also learned that persistence and dedication could eventually overcome even the most stubborn resistance to change. Her analysis had not only helped save FOB Viper, but had now been recognized at the highest levels of command as a model for improving intelligence operations throughout the theater. The young lieutenant who had arrived at FOB Viper 8 months earlier, ignored and dismissed by her colleagues, was leaving as a recognized expert whose work would influence intelligence operations across Afghanistan. Her name, once known to no one, was now mentioned in briefings at regional command headquarters and Pentagon planning sessions. Sarah Martinez had finally found her voice, and now it would echo through command structures far beyond the concrete barriers of a single forward operating base. The cost of that recognition had been higher than she could have imagined, but the potential to prevent similar tragedies at other bases made her sacrifice meaningful. As the helicopter carried her toward her new assignment, Sarah began planning her next battle against institutional complacency. There were more bases like FOB Viper, more junior officers being ignored, and more potential attacks being overlooked by systems more interested in procedure than protection. Her war against indifference was just beginning, and, this time, people would listen from the start. She would make sure of that, no matter what it cost her personally. The lives of her fellow soldiers depended on it, and Sarah Martinez was no longer willing to accept silence as an acceptable response to incompetence. The ignored lieutenant was gone. In her place was an officer whose name carried weight, whose analysis commanded attention, and whose warnings would no longer fall on deaf ears. It had taken tragedy to forge that transformation, but now it was complete. The helicopter banked toward the rising sun, carrying Sarah Martinez toward a future where her voice would matter from the very first word she spoke. 6 months after leaving FOB Viper, Sarah Martinez stood in a briefing room at the Pentagon, addressing a gathering of senior military officials that included 2 generals, several colonels, and the Deputy Secretary of Defense. The room was filled with people who had the power to reshape military intelligence operations across multiple theaters of conflict, and they were all listening to every word she said. The transformation was so complete that Sarah sometimes had trouble believing it herself. The junior lieutenant who had been ignored and dismissed at a remote Afghan base was now briefing some of the most senior officials in the United States military. Her analysis of intelligence failures had become required reading at staff colleges. Her recommendations for improving threat assessment procedures had been implemented at dozens of bases across Afghanistan and Iraq. The fundamental problem, she was explaining to the assembled officials, is not a lack of information, but a failure to properly analyze and act on the information we already have. In every case study we've examined, the intelligence necessary to predict and prevent attacks was present in our systems. What was missing was the analytical framework to recognize patterns and the institutional willingness to act on unconventional assessments. General Morrison, a veteran of 3 combat deployments and the current Director of Military Intelligence, leaned forward with interest. Lieutenant Martinez, your report mentions that junior officers are often the first to identify these patterns. Why do you think that is? Sarah had given considerable thought to this question over the past months. Sir, I believe it's because junior officers are often more willing to look at data without preconceptions about what they should find. Senior officers, understandably, are influenced by experience and previous patterns. But, in asymmetric warfare, the enemy is constantly adapting their tactics. Sometimes fresh eyes are more likely to spot new approaches. The Deputy Secretary nodded thoughtfully. What you're suggesting would require significant changes to how we structure intelligence operations. Are you confident that these changes would prevent future intelligence failures? Sir, I can't guarantee prevention of all intelligence failures, Sarah replied honestly. But I can say with confidence that the current system is failing to utilize available information effectively. The attack on FOB Viper could have been prevented if proper analytical procedures had been in place. Based on our review of similar incidents, many other attacks could have been prevented as well. After her presentation, Sarah was approached by Colonel Patricia Wells, who had been tasked with implementing the new intelligence protocols that Sarah had helped develop. Wells had the kind of reputation that made other officers speak in respectful whispers. She was known for getting things done regardless of bureaucratic obstacles.
"Lieutenant, I've read your file," Wells said without preamble.
"What happened to you at FOB Viper should never have happened to any officer.
But I'm more interested in what you plan to do next."
"The Pentagon is offering you a permanent assignment here, developing intelligence policy. It's a good opportunity, maybe even a fast track to senior positions."
Sarah had been expecting this conversation.
The Pentagon assignment was everything a young officer could want: proximity to power, involvement in high-level decision-making, and the kind of career advancement that most officers only dreamed about. But she had been thinking about a different path. "Ma'am, I appreciate the opportunity, but I'd like to request assignment to the Joint Intelligence Training Center. I want to work directly with junior officers who are about to deploy. If we're going to change how intelligence analysis is conducted, it has to start with the people who will actually be doing the work."
Wells raised an eyebrow. "You're turning down a Pentagon assignment to become an instructor?"
"Yes, ma'am.
The problems I identified at FOB Viper weren't unique to that base. They're systemic issues that exist throughout our intelligence community.
The only way to fix them is to train the next generation of intelligence officers to think differently about their role and responsibilities."
Wells studied her for a long moment. "You realize that teaching positions don't typically lead to rapid advancement? You could be giving up significant career opportunities." Sarah had considered this extensively.
Her experience at FOB Viper had taught her that career advancement meant nothing if it came at the cost of operational effectiveness. She had seen what happened when institutional priorities took precedence over mission requirements. "Ma'am, I believe the most important work I can do is ensuring that future intelligence officers understand their responsibility to speak up when they identify threats, regardless of how their assessments might be received by superiors.
If that means slower career advancement, I'm willing to accept that trade-off."
Wells smiled for the first time in their conversation.
"Lieutenant Martinez, I think you'll find that doing important work has a way of leading to advancement whether you're seeking it or not. The Joint Intelligence Training Center assignment is yours if you want it."
3 months later, Sarah stood in front of her first class of new intelligence officers at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. The 24 students represented the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines, all of them preparing for their first intelligence assignments in combat zones. They looked young and eager, much as she had when she first arrived at FOB Viper. "The most important thing you'll learn in this course," she told them, "is not how to process reports or maintain filing systems. It's how to think critically about information and how to communicate your analysis effectively, even when your conclusions are unwelcome." She told them about FOB Viper, about the months of being ignored and dismissed, about the attack that could have been prevented if anyone had been willing to listen to an inconvenient analysis. She saw recognition in many of their faces. Several of them had already experienced similar frustrations in their training assignments. "You will face pressure to conform, to avoid rocking the boat, to process information rather than analyze it," she continued.
"You need to understand that your primary responsibility is not to your immediate supervisors or to institutional procedures.
Your primary responsibility is to the soldiers whose lives depend on the quality of your intelligence analysis." The course Sarah developed at the Joint Intelligence Training Center became a model for intelligence education throughout the military. Students learned not just technical skills, but critical thinking, communication, and the moral courage necessary to deliver unpopular assessments when operational requirements demanded it. Her reputation grew steadily. Officers who had been trained by Sarah began to distinguish themselves in operational assignments, earning recognition for the quality and accuracy of their intelligence work. Senior commanders started requesting officers who had completed her training program. 2 years after the attack on FOB Viper, Sarah received a call from Colonel Harrison, who had been promoted and was now commanding a brigade in Syria. The conversation was brief but meaningful. "Sarah," he said, using her first name for the first time she could remember, "I wanted you to know that the intelligence procedures you developed are still being used at FOB Viper and throughout Regional Command. More importantly, we've prevented 3 major attacks in the past year because intelligence officers trained in your methodology were able to identify threat patterns that would have been missed under the old system." The validation meant more to Sarah than any medal or commendation could have. Knowing that her work was saving lives, that the lessons learned from her experience at FOB Viper were protecting soldiers throughout multiple theaters of conflict, justified every frustration she had endured. But, perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Captain Brooks, the former section chief who had dismissed her analysis and nearly ended her career, contacted her through official channels to request a private meeting. They met at a coffee shop near the Pentagon, 2 officers whose careers had taken very different paths since their time at FOB Viper. Brooks looked older and tired, bearing the weight of professional failure that had ended his military career and limited his civilian opportunities. "Lieutenant Martinez," he began formally, then stopped and started again. "Sarah, I owe you an apology that's about 2 years overdue. I was wrong about your analysis, wrong about your capabilities, and wrong about my responsibilities as your supervisor." Sarah listened without interrupting as he continued. "I've read about your work since leaving the Army. The intelligence training program you developed, the policy changes you've influenced, the recognition you've received. It's everything I should have encouraged and supported when you were under my command." He paused, struggling with words that clearly didn't come easily. 12 soldiers died in that attack. They died because I was more interested in maintaining my authority than in listening to sound analysis. I have to live with that for the rest of my life." Sarah felt no satisfaction in Brooks's obvious remorse. The vindication she had once thought she wanted felt hollow in the face of the personal cost he was paying for his mistakes. "Captain, we both learned important lessons from that experience. The question now is how we use those lessons to prevent similar failures in the future." They talked for another hour about intelligence analysis, leadership, and the responsibility that military officers bear for the lives of their subordinates. When they parted, Sarah felt that a chapter of her life had finally closed, allowing her to focus completely on the future rather than the past. 5 years after the attack on FOB Viper, Sarah Martinez was promoted to major and assigned as the deputy director of the Joint Intelligence Training Center. Her name was known throughout the intelligence community, not as the lieutenant who had been ignored, but as the officer who had transformed how the military thought about intelligence analysis and institutional accountability. The changes she had initiated went far beyond individual training. Military intelligence doctrine had been revised to emphasize critical thinking and independent analysis. Promotion criteria for intelligence officers now included assessments of analytical capability rather than just administrative competence. Most importantly, formal procedures had been established to ensure that unconventional assessments from junior officers received proper consideration at appropriate levels of command. Standing in her new office, Sarah looked at the photographs covering one wall, pictures of intelligence officers she had trained who were now serving in combat zones around the world. Each face represented someone who understood that their primary loyalty was to the truth, regardless of how inconvenient that truth might be to their superiors. Her assistant knocked on the door to remind her of her next appointment, a briefing for a group of senior officers who were about to take command of intelligence units in active theaters. These were colonels and lieutenant colonels, seasoned officers who could make or break the careers of the junior officers serving under them. As she prepared for the briefing, Sarah thought about the young lieutenant she had once been, filing reports in a windowless office while enemies planned attacks that no one wanted to hear about. That lieutenant's voice had been ignored until disaster made it impossible to ignore any longer. Now, that same voice echoed through training centers and command structures across the military. The name Sarah Martinez appeared on policy documents and training curricula. Her analysis methodology was taught at staff colleges and war colleges. Her experience at FOB Viper had become a case study in the importance of listening to junior officers and the dangers of institutional complacency. The transformation was complete, but Sarah never forgot its cost. 12 soldiers had died to teach lessons that should have been learned without bloodshed. Her success was built on their sacrifice, and she carried the responsibility of ensuring that their deaths contributed to preventing future tragedies. Walking into the briefing room to address another group of senior officers, Sarah Martinez carried with her the voices of all the junior officers who had been dismissed and ignored, all the soldiers whose warnings had fallen on deaf ears, all the people who had tried to speak truth to power and been silenced by institutional indifference. Her name now echoed through command structures like a reminder that competence could overcome hierarchy, that truth could triumph over convenience, and that sometimes the most important voices belong to those with the least apparent authority. The ignored lieutenant had become an institutional force for change, her influence extending far beyond anything she could have imagined during those frustrating months at FOB Viper. But the real measure of her success would not be found in her own advancement, but in the lives saved by officers who had learned to listen, to analyze, and to speak up when it mattered most. Sarah Martinez had found her voice, and now it would continue to echo through the military long after her own career had ended, a permanent reminder that institutional change was possible when individuals had the courage to demand it.